This is a sub that a customer brought to me to recone, and he brought it to me because it never really acted right since he paid somebody else to recone it. He found out that there was a guy in another city. I don't know who it was. I only know the city that he was in South Carolina, and said he could recone it. He reconed it. Never really worked right. He was never really happy with it, so he brought it to me to recone it. So as I got into this, tearing it down, it made me think, when you know a guy who can recone it, what might you be getting? Now, not to say that there aren't people that are not capable of reconing a sub. Some are going to be better than others. Some have more experience than others. But you might get a deal. I don't know how much you paid for this, but you might get a deal on it, or what seems like a deal on it. Or it might be kind of a normal everyday price and you don't really know what you're going to get. So I'm going to go over everything on this sub as to why he wasn't happy with it and what this guy did that was basically wrong. All of it was wrong. So I've already torn it down. Obviously there's a lot of wear that's not build related, unless they were trying to somehow reuse parts. So that's fine. This is whatever. I cut out the spider, and I thought everything was going to be fine till I go to pull it out. Now remember, the subs had some play on it, so I wasn't really sure what I would find, but you can hear that and see that it's kind of hard to pull out, and it's not because the coil is unraveled. It's because of this indicating it was rubbing the top plate pretty badly. It was on this side. It wasn't on the inside. It wasn't so much on this side. It was a little bit over here. Another note, this right here, and yeah, so in those spots, that's from Brazilian type full bridge amplifier. It's been pointed out in a few other videos, but that's what that is. These are from rubbing. That's from rubbing. Coil's broken down here. It did not smack the back plate. If it did, this would be perfectly flat, but it's still rounded. So this is grabbed somewhere, somehow. So how does that happen? Well, it could be misaligned when it was put in, if it didn't have a proper shim. Like maybe the spider wasn't laid completely flat, so it's a little bit crooked. Usually that would be from not having the correct shim size. But like I said, you would see it on this side, the inside here and the outside here, if it was coming down sideways. So what would be causing that? It's using the wrong coil. Just because it physically fits in the gap does not mean it's a good fit. I measured the top plate. I measured the coil. And there is a 0.3, so 0.3 of a millimeter difference between the outside of the coil and the top plate. That means there is 0.15 millimeters gap between the coil and the top plate. And that's assuming that the top plate is exactly perfectly machined. It's possible that there was a slight tolerance of maybe 0.1 millimeters, which is why this thing was rubbing and doing all kinds of crazy things. Another fine point in that is the coil will not cool properly. This couldn't have had very much power on it for very long, or the whole bottom half of the coil would have cooked. The top is vented from this spacer here, but the bottom, there's a very, very small pull vent, and the bottom of this would not cool. There's no gap vents, any of that. So no air can pass through the bottom of the coil. Even if it wasn't rubbing, gap too small, it would eventually just cook itself in the gap. You can see it's a very tall top plate. It would just be holding all that air in that small gap. So it's a 35 millimeter top plate and a 50 millimeter long winding, I think. So yeah, that's no good. The rest of the assembly is not bad. This appears to be a CA glue. Not too bad. In here, not too bad. The spider and the surround were both along with epoxy. Not CA or E6000, but definitely epoxy. So the actual assembly of the parts, not bad. The parts chosen, very bad. Now there's some other assembly issues that I discovered. It was pointed out to me that for whatever reason, some type of metal repair paste was used right here. It is not JB Weld. I'm not exactly sure what it is. I have some other ideas, but it's conductive. It's also touching this terminal, and I don't think it's quite touching this one. If it was touching both, these would be dead shorted because of this. It's just kind of shoddily put in there. You can't go through this paint. Paint is non-conductive. But if it was touching, made it, if there was conductive paint or made it all the way through because they ground it down, which they may have, then this would make the whole basket the polarity of this here because it's conductive. So if any other terminal had a problem, it would bridge that. The appropriate thing to do here, because it's a piece of plastic that these mount to, appropriate thing would be to either replace these two single terminals or replace this whole thing, or do anything that's not using a conductive material and putting that back on. So these are getting replaced. Now there's still more. The mounting of the basket to the motor. These are the bolts that are used. Well, there's also different lengths of bolts. Two of them are still in the motor, just for holding this together right now purposes, but I have removed all of them. You might notice this is not a flat head, a pan head as they call it. And that means it doesn't lay flat on the basket that is also flat. So you've got a very, very small contact patch right here that's holding it in. And I could have taken these out by hand. It required absolutely no torque to get these out. I'm kind of shocked they're still in there. But it gets even better. These are actually an M8 instead of an M6, which is typically standard, but if it was an 8, whatever. There's only 4 bolts in the motor, and I'm gonna take these out so I can show you some more. So we've removed the bolts. We've got a Sundown Audio basket that was used and half of a Sundown Audio metal spacer. I originally thought it was another company's spacer, but it was one half of it upside down. They had to drill out the basket to get the M8 bolts in. They had to drill out the spacer to get the M8 bolts in. I know what you're thinking. Sure, this uses M8 bolts, except for it kind of doesn't. There's 2 different patterns out here. Those are all M6. And there's 2 M8s here, 2 M8s here, and 2 M6s here. So I had 4 bolts because they only drilled and retapped 4 of the 6 mounting bolts. I'm guessing they got stripped out. Is the only reason you would do that? I don't know. If they would have done all of them, it wouldn't be as bad. If they would have used pan heads, it would have even not been as bad. But it's pretty awful. What I was mentioning about the pole vent, there's one pretty small pole vent. That's about maybe a ½ inch. And the gap on this is extremely tight. This is a 3-inch coil. And the gap is very, very tight, so you do have pretty limited coil options. The replacements that I have appropriate gaps, both at the pole and at the top plate, so we're going to be good there. But another fine point in all of this is the customer was led to believe that this was a Sundown Audio motor. I'm not sure if someone told him that or what, but it is not. I don't know what motor it is. It's not actually a real fantastic design motor. And it kind of goes back to just because it's big doesn't mean it's strong. So we have our mouse meter. See if I can keep that on camera there. So we put that in the gap. We're getting around 6,000, 6,200. So this big old gigantic motor is about as strong as a band hammer motor, and several others. So gigantic motor doesn't mean it's actually stronger. The top plate thickness does have something to do with that. You can't go off of the Gauss number itself. But when I adjust for a smaller top plate, which will give you a higher number with the same magnetism, that's where we're similar to like a band hammer motor. So this whole thing is collectively a basket case that I have to correct, but that does make you wonder, what is it that you're getting when somebody says, I can recone that, or I know a guy who can recone that? Make sure it's somebody reputable, and maybe if you've seen any of their work. If you know somebody who's had work done by someone and they say they did mine, I recommend them, sure, go off of that. Maybe you'll be fine. That's how he found me, as one of my prior customers who's had me do some work before said, talk to this guy. And that's how I ended up with this one. So not everyone is bad. There are people that are capable of rebuilding subs. But you also want to make sure that what you're going to get is actually going to be something good, so you don't end up throwing money away.